Don't be envious.
Dude. Yeah, dude.
One
Corn
more.
snakes. I'm Mike.
I'm Dean Snyder.
Dean?
Dean.
Is that what his name is?
D.
Oh, sorry, D. Snyder. All right. I'm D. Snyder.
I'm Michael, dude.
And I'm Dave Kaufman. Rattle on. Actually, no. This is MTV! No, it's not that either. This is just Snake Envy, as usual. But it's 1985. You're a little younger than us, Michael. We're happy to be joined by Michael with Solid Serpents. How old were you in 85?
I was 2 years old.
Oh, my goodness. Why do we even have you here?
Because I'm fresh. Fresh, dude. It's my bogus journey.
So Jason and I were born in the 70s, really kind of children of the 80s. That was our formative years. And our introduction to the reptile hobby was really taking place in the 80s. But we are going to do a series of 3 videos about the evolution of the hobby from the 80s till now. The 80s is when things were just starting to come together in terms of captive breeding. But what was your introduction to the hobby?
Killer rock and roll.
Yes. Besides that.
Cow Kings, just like this one right here.
Yep. This is Veronica, my female cow king. And yes, cow kings were everywhere in the 80s. But even before you could buy captive ones, what was the first snakes you were keeping?
Well, the first snakes I were keeping were garters, because that's what I was catching.
Yep. They came out of the wild. And for those who are younger than us, that's really how everybody got into the hobby back then. It was very rare that your introduction to the hobby was finding a breeder, and there were no reptile shows. There was no internet. There was no YouTube. There was MTV, but no YouTube. So if you wanted a snake, more often than not, you were catching one in the wild. And then, little by little, people started breeding those animals they were catching. So out west, where Jason and I were living, these California Kings ruled. They were everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you lived back east, there were probably Florida Kings, Eastern Kings. But how about these guys? What have you got there, Michael?
This is a corn snake, which I'm sure in the southeast United States people were catching and keeping.
The corns were one of the first.
They were the first, really, in the
Deliverance, one of the first.
the 60s. The doctor, I forgot her. Was it?
As a corn snake breeder today, do you happen to know, like, is there a corn snake breeder you guys talk about, a legend in the hobby, one of the OGs?
There's Bill and Kathy Love, I think, were the ones that really set everything in motion for the worldwide stage, because she was traveling around in her mobile zoo in the 80s, just breeding stuff, and then she pumped out all these corn snake morphs, wrote the book. That was in the 90s, though. I believe she wrote Corn Snake Volume 1 and then number 2. But Kathy Love is the one that everybody says is the corn snake OG.
Probably the OG. So that's cool. That's interesting. But yes, in terms of captive breeding, particularly among colubrids here in the United States, these two, and then, like I say, probably Florida Kings, Eastern Kings. I'm sure there were a few kings. But out west where I lived, this was it. I mean, if you found somebody who bred snakes, and it was all word of mouth, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was somebody's brother's friend.
Yeah, there was no internet. There was
no. I was in Southeast Texas in 81 through 84, and there was a guy who had primarily a fish store, an aquarium store, but he had a few pair of breeding cow kings. And that's where I got an introduction to these. But it was all word of mouth. Like, did you have a buddy who had a friend who had a brother? That's how you always heard about it.
Yeah, pretty much.
in the 90s video, we'll probably talk about mailing lists. And, that was one of the things. And then in the late 90s, we had online forums and chat groups.
And Reptile Magazine.
Reptile Magazine. But for the 80s, it was all word of mouth. It was all, who you knew.
That was out here. Now, I know in Ohio they had the conventions. It was really the first reptile convention that everybody started going to. Then they had the Herpetological Society pamphlet that they would pass around.
Oh, really?
And then the first one was down in Orlando at those two towers. Is that what it's called?
Was that as early as the 80s, though?
The 80s is when it all started. The late 80s.
Interesting. Late 80s.
Is when all those expos, but I don't think it was out here. It all seemed to resonate around Ohio. And then down in Orlando, there's the stories about the Twin Towers. Then that eventually turned into Daytona.
Yeah.
But that was all the latter half of the 80s when those Midwest and East Coast guys got together. So I'm sure the Western folk were delayed a bunch.
Interesting. Yeah, the wild snakes. So Jason and I have talked about it. Your parents weren't crazy about snakes in the house.
Nope.
How about yours?
My mom actually liked snakes. I don't think my dad did. Because I grew up in Seattle, so I had the garter snakes. And they were beautiful. I'd just go catch them in ponds.
Yeah.
Beautiful blues and reds and yellows.
Yeah, in Texas in the early 80s where we were catching snakes like crazy. My parents, to this day, don't know how many snakes were in the house
really?
at any given time. We were hiding them everywhere. I don't think my brother was really into them. But, I had them hidden all over the place. I'd figured out where I could stash them in my room. Which kind of leads me to the husbandry question. What do you remember about husbandry in the 80s?
Well, I didn't even work with snakes until the 90s.
So you was primarily
I was
lizard guy.
I was lizards and I was
frogs.
breeding anoles and stuff like that.
Yeah. But that goes to show you, snakes were they were just kind of barely being introduced as a mainstay pet.
You remember the pet stores would always have a red-tailed boa.
Boas and pythons were huge, it seemed like, in the 80s, before colubrids.
Yeah,
Something big and impressive.
Particularly red-tailed boas, and that's the other snake we want to mention in addition to these. But yeah, I was hiding them all over the house. Like he hides the weed from us on the tour bus. But
right now,
yes,
Sammy Hagar.
Yes,
jeez, dude.
But
bogus, man.
But red-tailed boas, I can't remember if it was in elementary school or junior high, but everybody had a red-tailed boa. At least one classroom in school had a red-tailed boa. Red-tailed boas were kind of the corn snake of the boa and python.
Seemed like it. Boa was what I always called every snake.
Yeah.
It's a boa.
Everything was a boa.
Yeah.
Boas they're not quite as hardy as these guys. Your husbandry's got to be a little more spot on.
Yeah,
you
humidity,
might have to be humidity, temperatures, or you might be dealing with respiratory infections, so not quite as hardy. But they were big, they were beautiful, they had a great temperament. We're going to talk about these two guys individually here in just a bit. So red-tailed boa classrooms. I never saw colubrids in classrooms. There was always boas, maybe a python. And of course, back then I didn't know the difference between a boa and a python. What else? What do you guys remember about herping or collecting? You obviously have no memories of the 80s.
Yeah, the 80s. I was too little.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember just hitting all the local spots. We grew up on the west side of Salt Lake Valley, and we had my friend's mom. She was home all the time, and she would drive us over to Sandy, and it's all developed now, but there was this big giant sand pit where Fort Union Boulevard is, and
oh really?
Oh wow!
Snakes and lizards, and there was a permanent pond at the bottom with tiger salamanders. They would never fully
Sandy?
metamorphose.
Wow.
They would stay in that larva with
cool.
the gills.
I can't even picture that.
Very cool.
Right where that Target is on Fort Union, that was our playground.
Wow. Jeez. Yeah, and for those who don't live here, I mean, it's all
it's a
completely developed now. Amazing. I was talking to somebody the other day about Footloose, about the movie Footloose, because a photo was going around on social media of the old roller mill and Lehigh, and I was trying to explain to them that the modern day picture of Lehigh which was taken from the gas station kitty corner to the roller mill, does not do it justice. Footloose was a great 80s film, by the way. But yeah, Lehigh now is Silicon Slopes. It's the tech sector completely built up. And in the movie Footloose, that was all legit. It was all empty. It was all farmland. There was nothing there. So it's amazing how things have changed, not only in the hobby, but just in general. So for me, the 80s are all about music outside of snakes. I mean, this is it, man. It was the hair bands. The hair bands ruled back in the 80s. Now, Jason, your tastes run a little harder.
Yeah, he's metal.
You're the metal guy.
I grew up in the teenage years and thrash metal was coming out, and then death metal. And yeah, old Metallica, Testament, Anthrax, DRI. There's some great stuff back in the late 80s.
Without a doubt. So we're going to do a couple... we touched on the boas. We don't have a boa here with us. We're going to do a couple little separate segments here on the corn and the king and kind of talk about why they became popular. Mike is our corn expert. He's a corn snake breeder. So we'll touch base on that. But like I say, we're going to do 2 more videos. We're going to touch on the 90s and the growth of the hobby in the 90s. Late in the 90s, the internet comes along, and that changes everything. And then, yes, the reptile expos, that expo thing starts spreading across the country. 90s is when I first started hearing about expos. And then we're going to do a third video, just basically the 2000s to the present day.
Yeah.
Where the hobby has exploded. But for now, let's talk a little bit about cow kings and corns.
Never mix them. Never put the new people. Do not put a corn snake with that. That thing will eat this up.
In fact, that's why we have Jason in the middle. He's a buffer between these 2 snakes. She's never shown any aggression toward other snakes, but
she wants to eat this little baby so bad.
That can change on a dime. That can change on a dime.
She's licking her lips.
Yes.
She's ready to...
And I would be powerless to stop her. Thank you.
I'm so hot right now.
Hey, don't be envious.
Corn snakes, the reason why they are so popular is, first of all, they're local to the United States. Anybody can just go out and grab one and think, ooh, this is a pretty snake. Now, this is not a normal snake. This is not a normal corn snake. We don't have one of those around here. But you just walk out and you grab one. It's not biting your head off. And then you can just really, back in the day, throw it in a 10-gallon fish tank and it will live. I know nowadays you have to have a 75,000-gallon fish tank for a corn snake. But back in the day, just throw this in a 10-gallon. You don't even need a heat pad. Throw a centipede in there. They'll try to eat it, but they won't eat it. That's what they were doing back in the day. And then they figured out, oh, these will eat mice. They probably fed them earthworms. But that's what they did back in the day. And they still lived, and now they're just the most glorious pet snake of all snakes. A corn snake, dude.
So, king snakes, why were they among the first in the 80s to become so popular? In part because they're native here to the U.S. They didn't have to be imported. Everybody could catch them. Made them easy then to collect pairs and breed them. Their temperament, for the most part, is pretty amazing. They eat like nothing else. And so they were really easy to care for, very hardy. Your husbandry didn't have to be spot on. And one thing we probably didn't touch on enough was in the 80s, we were clueless about husbandry for the most part. We thought, well, it's 90 degrees outside, so basically our snakes are going to want it warm. So a lot of snakes were being kept too warm. Other snakes were being kept too cold because there was no heat source at all. I remember the big innovation in husbandry was AstroTurf. You put that, there was that store I mentioned in Texas that sold the reptile supplies. He sold that stuff by the roll. You'd cut it to size for your enclosure. You put that in there. When cleaning time came, you just take it out, you hose it off. You spritz it down with something that would sanitize it a little bit, hose it off again, and that was that. You put it back in. So hardy snakes like king snakes, corn snakes, red-tail boas, that's why they were so popular in the 80s. Because even though we didn't always know what we were doing, it didn't matter. the snakes, for the most part, did pretty well. As we started keeping more and more exotic snakes, that's where husbandry came into play and became more and more important. If you didn't get it right, your snake didn't live. We didn't have that problem with kings and corns for the most part. But in hindsight, maybe those times they weren't eating so well because we didn't know what we were doing in terms of husbandry. But 2 almost bulletproof snakes, kings and corns, and that's why they got the hobby off to a running start. This is Snake Envy. I want my MTV.
I can't drive 55.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 1983, I was birthed from my mother in Eugene, Oregon. Peak of Michael Jackson. That's the 80s.
Pro Hagar.
It's like a pyromania, baby. I want to burn this place to the ground.
Party on, man. Dude.